It's only natural that every single Pokemon will eventually crumble to some degree to the sad force that is power creep. So I wanted to document what I personally consider the worst fall-offs of each gen. Generation 1, Tauros. Tauros was pretty much on every single team in Gen 1 OU. I'm pretty sure you already know that. There's nothing at first glance that would make him seem more special than any other Pokemon right now. And you're right, but Tauros isn't the same Pokemon right now he was back then. He was fairly impressive in Generation 1 with a good special stat, as well as the normal type being incredibly overpowered because ghost types were not particularly relevant, neither were fighting types, and steel types just straight up did not exist. There was not a lot stopping Tauros, except another Tauros, which is why he was always saved for last, as a revenge killer of sorts. His most powerful attacks were his stab body slams and double edges, which nothing could stop, except for the only ghost type really, Gengar, but Tauros had Earthquake anyways, so it doesn't really matter, and since critical hits were determined by speed, his speed stat allowed him to have a crit rate of 21%, which if you're out here spamming body slams back and forth, that's guaranteed a few crits. So it might seem very strange that all of a sudden he dropped to UUBL, the next generation. Going from OU to UU isn't that rare, but number 1 OU Mon to UUBL Mon is kind of odd. A few things changed. Crits weren't dictated by speed anymore. The special stat is no longer 1, so he's no longer a good mixed attacker. On top of that, remember when I said steel types weren't a thing? Well, now they are, and specifically, the two Pokemon who kept Tauros in the UUBL tier, Limbo Purgatory, are Skarmory and Fortress. Essentially, Tauros just couldn't break through them. Then remember how I said that fighting types and ghost types were non-existent? Well, Generation 3 to 4 came along, and now they became more common, from Breloom, Lucario, Machamp, Dusclops, and the Rotom appliances. Tauros also had the role of a late-game sweeper, and there were just much better choices from Aerodactyl to Salamence to Flygon to Latios. They all had good stab types, and Normal became far from a good stab type, so it makes sense that he fell all the way to the ZU tier. Next is Generation 2, Snorlax. Snorlax has an infamously 50% win rate in GSCOU. Why? Because he was literally on every single team. Snorlax was a very bulky Pokemon. This was only emphasized even more by the fact that you could still max out stats at the time. So fun fact, the only thing that could reliably OHKO a Snorlax at max health without a critical hit was another Snorlax using self-destruct. But enough with those fun facts. Snorlax is possibly the best curse sweeper of all time. Combine that with its already sky-high HP and special defense stat, it was a nightmare to deal with. It's one of the reasons that Roar is such a common move. You need a way to deal with how common Curse-Lax sets are, and if he uses Belly Drum, he was just even more of a monster. He has a variety of sets that are meant to deal with every single Pokemon that can supposedly wall him, like Skarmory and Fortress. And even if you do manage to get Snorlax to low health, he is one of the GSC mons who has access to rest. In short, his amount of sets, versatility, in addition to bulk, made him the best Pokemon in OU and Ubers. So what went wrong? Well, fast forward the next gen, you can't max out stats anymore. So just like for the majority of Pokemon, that wasn't good for it. But one of his biggest ops was Skarmory, who was made even more common by the fact that he had access to Spikes and Roost. But new Pokemon that walled and checked it, like Metagross, Celebi, and Jirachi, also arrived, and fighting types became even more common. Next is Dugtrio. Dugtrio was huge in Gen 3 OU. Why? One word, Arena Trap. Dugtrio is fast, but not particularly strong, and a mono ground typing is useful, but not groundbreaking. So why is it OU? Arena Trap is an ability that traps all grounded Pokemon. That is huge, and for this reason he's used. He can trap some of the best Pokemon in the game, most notably Tyranitar, Metagross, Jirachi, Magneton, and Blissey, who are all pretty much OHKO'd by an Earthquake, except for Blissey's overweight self, who takes 2 Earthquakes to KO, as well as Hidden Power Bug, which was for Celebi. Although it doesn't seem strong, and to be fair it's not strong, it might seem very frail, and it is. So it needs a good amount of support, but if it has that, it's incredibly effective. So what happened? Well, as I said a bit earlier, Arena Trap, it's usually banned. So the only thing that he had going for him, he doesn't have anymore. The reason why it isn't banned in Generation 3 is more because it helps balance out how bulky and difficult to deal with some of the steel types in Gen 3 are. Also, in Gen 3 it has a very limited move pool because of the lack of physical special split, so he's not really overpowered. Next is Gen 4, Azelf. Azelf was a very popular Pokemon on hyper offense teams, as well as a variety of other teams. He was all you could ask for in Elite. access to Stealth Rock, access to Taunt, access to U-Turn, access to Thunder Wave, and a speed stat that outsped 90% of Pokemon. And of course, as all leads did, he had access to Explosion. He really was a perfect lead with a variety of offensive moves like Fire Blast, Zen Headbutt, Ice Punch. He was a Pokemon you absolutely had to be able to deal with. He really seemed perfect. So what exactly went wrong? Well, number 1, mediocre mono psychic typing. Back in Generation 4, that already wasn't super good since it made him very vulnerable to most notably the move Pursuit. And Team Preview became a thing eventually. Had a dedicated lead pretty much always, was because there was no Team Preview. And Explosion became nerf. That's 2 things Azelf heavily relied on as a lead, just gone. Azelf still had a spot on many teams as either a pivot, but its natural fragility and lack of good typing and general power creep made it very hard for him to survive. It relied a lot on its high speed stat, but it was very vulnerable to priority moves, so there wasn't much he could offer. Spots reserved specifically for leads were becoming rarer and rarer, and he was becoming increasingly power-cracked. So its fall was a lot slower than other Pokemon, but I really did want to mention it because of how popular he was at some point. Next is Gen 5, Politoed. Generation 5 is described as the Weather Wars generation, and for good reason. One of the most popular types of weather teams is a rain team. Although perhaps not the best, they were some of the most common. There were really only 2 Pokemon who had access to Drizzle. One was Kyogre, who is, a little bit too powerful for the likes of Gen 5 OU, and the only other option was Politoed. Politoed was the only Drizzlemon available, the chosen one. It went from NU to OU literally just because of Drizzle. It was a necessity. It facilitated its strong teammates like Thundurus, Keldeo, and Latios. So, did he continue to be a good weather setter? Well, no, not exactly. Soon enough, another Pokemon who was just far better at setting rain came into existence. A little birdie called Pelipper. Pelipper had far better typing, reliable recovery, access to good stat moves like Hurricane, and as well as Defog and Knockoff. Although Stealth Rock damage isn't optimal, he is just so much better than anything Politoed can offer. He was frail, weak, and could definitely be a nightmare to keep around. Pelipper isn't exactly a powerhouse, but he's a lot more useful than Politoed ever was. Generation 6, Latios. I had a lot of trouble picking the right Pokemon for Gen 6. There weren't any super surprising Pokemon that had a sudden fall off from Great's Politoed style, but I chose Latios. It wasn't a fall that was super dramatic, but still, Generation 6 was good for Latios. It was a good check to Pokemon like Breloom, Keldeo, and Manaphy. It had been one of the most reliable Dragon types for several generations straight, ever since Gen 4, when it was introduced to the OU tier. Whether it was wielding a Latias sight, a Soul Dew, a Choice Scarf, or a Choice Specs, it was a fast and powerful threat to take on, with Calm Mind making it a very powerful sweeper. However, it had a few shortcomings, like most Steel types, Dark types, and your newly introduced and very common Fairy types. Latias was having a bit of a hard time, so the next generation it fell to UU. Not the most dramatic fall, but it was an OU title holder, so this was new. And even though it wasn't too surprising, it sure felt like it. While its mega form was OU, its non-mega form wasn't. It was still kept in check by your common special walls, like Blissey, and Dark types were still a thorn in its side. Other Psychic types were also just much better, like Mega Alakazam, Tapu Lele, and Victini. Next Generation 7, Chansey. Chansey had been the best special wall for, at this point, 3 generations straight. Along with Blissey, they were always kind of neck and neck fighting for the crown of the best stall queen ever. So, with its enormous special bowl, its massive HP stat, it's really rare that a special wall is so good at its job. The only reliable way to defeat it is really with a physical attacker, and more specifically, a strong physical fighting type. There were very few special attackers that could actually deal with Chansey. One of the only ways to really reliably deal with it as a special attacker was if you were Manaphy under Rain, which is just such an incredibly specific circumstance that no one's going to run Manaphy just to deal with Chansey. So what happened? Her amazing special book couldn't possibly be topped by anyone else. That's true, it couldn't be topped, but it also didn't need to be topped. It just needed to be replaced, and that's what Blissey did. One of the few ways to deal with Chansey was chip damage. The only reason Chansey outclassed Blissey before was because of Eviolite, an item that it needed to hold. But when Generation 8 came around, Blissey got access to heavy-duty boots, something that she really needed. That's how Blissey came and took the Stall Queen crown from Chansey, because chip damage is really one of the only reliable ways to deal with Stall mons. Generation 8, Mew. From Generation 8 to 9, a lot of Pokemon who were fan favorites got power crept, so it was really hard to choose one. I considered the lovable Tyranitar, Garchomp, Toxapex, Toxapex is really only loved by me, but still, they were all OU Titans who fell from OU to UU. But I'm choosing Mew, because Mew fell from OU all the way down to RU. Mythicals like Mew were bound to be power crept eventually, especially when you consider mediocre typing of Monopsychic, mediocre ability of Synchronize, and mediocre stats of just 100 all across the board, which were not impressive and hadn't been for a while. But what did make Mew valuable was its unmatched unpredictability. Mew had access to the vast majority of moves, a move pool most Pokemon could only dream of having. That alone made it incredibly valuable. Then Gen 9 happened, and Game Freak nerfed the hell out of its move pool. Mew lost access to Defog, Roost, Recover, Soft Boil, Cosmic Power, and Teleport. It was the betrayal of us all naked mole rat fans who loved Mew. Its move pool was synonymous with its identity, and when that was taken away from it, so was its competitive value. And just like that, Mew dropped all the way to RU. Those are my personal opinions of the biggest fall-offs. Biggest fall-offs is a bit of a subjective thing, but let me know if you agree or disagree.